I'm Eleanor. I've never considered myself particularly smart, but because of my family, I had to teach myself a lot. If you were to see my family, you would think we look like a normal family. I live with both of my parents and I have 2 younger siblings. My older brother has quit college and is trying to figure out what to do. My sister, Rachel, graduated from high school last year. She was the valedictorian. Now she's training to become a police officer. See? Normal. But that's only when you look at us. The truth is that if you were to talk to my family, well, then it starts to become obvious. Something isn't quite right. Not that you can put your finger on what the problem is, not at first. A few years ago, I remember we were at a family reunion and my mother's brother was talking about toothpaste. My parents and brother were engrossed in what he was saying. It looked like Rachel was trying not to laugh. I left playing with my cousins to listen to them. I thought I would finally learn why his breath was so bad. When I started to listen, I could not believe what he was saying. According to my uncle, the government put stuff into our toothpaste to track us. When we brush our teeth, the government can use that to monitor us. That's why he doesn't brush his teeth anymore. Not at all. When I heard that, I laughed. I mean, there was no way that he could be serious, right? When I stopped laughing, I noticed that my parents and brother were frowning at me. My uncle had stormed off. My mother's father walked up to us, shaking his head before my parents could say anything. He started talking about how ridiculous the idea was. My parents and brother seemed to agree after this. But once we were in the car on the way home, they began talking about how it might be a good idea to be safe. After all, my uncle was a specialist. That's what they said. The problem was that he wasn't in the medical profession. He was a computer specialist. So he couldn't have had any idea. Then my parents started to speculate. They said if he thought that toothpaste was possibly a way to track us, there must be some kind of nanotechnology. That was why my uncle knew about it. Then they said that my grandfather couldn't possibly understand. Rachel and I shared a look, but we didn't say anything as my parents and older brother talked about things that we should be doing, just in case. When my sister brought up what my grandfather said, my mother waved off the idea. After all, he grew up in a different time. He was too old to understand the risks. I wanted to say that my uncle didn't have any idea either, but I didn't. My mother had always looked up to him, and she always believed he really knew what he was talking about. That was when my family, my life, started to change. I remember getting ready for school the next day and finding that my mother had taken all of our toothpaste. I couldn't brush my teeth. Fortunately, I had some gum, so I chewed on that before class. I was only in middle school at the time, so I was really paranoid about being different. Rachel picked me up from school, which was weird. She was in high school and usually didn't want to be seen with her uncool younger sister, but she said this was important. We went to a convenience store on the way home and she bought me a small thing of toothpaste. I kept it in my book bag. My mom did make toothpaste for us, but it was gross. She watched all of us, the excitement in her eyes. How could I tell her it was terrible? Rachel was less careful, and she got into trouble for it. No TV until she started brushing her teeth with the new stuff. My brother complained about the taste, but acted like he was willing to make the sacrifice. It was the right thing to do, he claimed. After that, things started to change around the house. They started to grow their own food. This part I kind of liked because the food did taste fresher, but they stopped taking us out to restaurants because it was too risky. Not because their credit card information might get stolen. I mean, that I could understand. No, they didn't want to go to restaurants because that was how the government got you. Over 2 years, the things that the government could do to get you grew from small things into something much worse. My parents stopped paying for our phones, then said we couldn't have them in the house. The only phones allowed in the house were connected to the landline. They got rid of our computers because, as they said, everything that was posted could be tracked. It got really difficult to do homework, and my grades actually started to suffer. I started going over to my friends' houses more often, and I never invited them over anymore. Not after one of them, Karen, started to talk about how weird my family was at school. She said that if my family got any crazier, they would have to be taken away. I felt torn between my friends and my family. Most of my friends weren't as critical as Karen, but it was obvious that they were uncomfortable hanging out at my house. I was invited to less and less. Rachel reached her last year of school. She wasn't sure whether she should ask our family to the graduation, especially after what happened over winter break. Rachel was really frustrated with how crazy some of their new rules were, and she began to shout at them to stop and think about things logically. She held up the toothpaste as an example and started to debunk what my uncle had said. How could things be tracked through toothpaste? It was either spit out or small parts swallowed. With all of the bacteria in our mouths, there would be no way to track people, let alone how much it would cost. Not to mention the fact that my brother had had 3 teeth pulled because of cavities. He had refused to have fillings because he claimed that the government could control him with fillings. All of her arguments were sound, but my parents didn't listen. They told her that she was the one not thinking, that she was too naive and sheltered. They said that they had failed as parents if she couldn't see just how corrupt the world around us was. The fight escalated until Rachel decided she couldn't take it anymore. She packed up her things and moved out that night. After that, my parents didn't really talk about it much. When they did mention Rachel, it was almost like she was a criminal or a mental patient. They would say that they hoped she would get better, but it was out of their hands. My dad wanted to talk to her, but my mother insisted that it was better to let her be. Eventually, my mother said my sister would realize that they were right. She said she would pray, that we should all pray, but we couldn't risk being contaminated by her way of thinking. Of course, I was really uncomfortable with this. I wasn't going to tell my parents that I didn't agree with them. I was only 16 at the time, and I didn't know where I would live. I didn't know where Rachel planned to live, but I knew she would be all right. I was a different story. Rachel had a job and still kept up her grades. I knew that I couldn't do both. I found out after school started that Rachel had gone to live with Grandma and Grandpa. It was a lot further from school, but she said it was worth it. After that, she would sometimes bring me things from her home to eat. Over a month, I noticed that my sister started to look healthier and happier. She smiled more, and she didn't look so skinny as when she lived with my parents. I mean, I knew that we had all lost weight when my parents changed our diets, but I thought it was all right. We wanted to be thin. It was only seeing my sister get better that I had realized how unhealthy we had become. My parents hadn't exactly researched the changes to our diets because they had become suspicious of online information. It had never occurred to me that my weight loss and lack of energy had been a direct result of what they had done. Then they started making us do all kinds of weird stuff. Like when we came home, my parents would check our mouths to make sure nothing had been implanted in them. They then used little boxes used by paranormal people to check to see if any entities had been attached to us while we were at school. After that, we had to take a shower to wash off the remnants from chemtrails. Going home became a real hassle because we would be scrutinized for almost an hour just to make sure we hadn't been infected by anything. When I tried to point out that the biggest problem was the fact that we seemed to be losing too much weight, my father said that women were supposed to be really thin. To prove this, he would use pictures of indigenous tribes who had not been exposed to modern civilization. My mom said that the government was making sure that people were getting fatter because it made it easier for us to be tracked by the aliens living under Area 51. After she said this, my dad quickly shushed her, and he looked at me like I couldn't be trusted with this information. I think they believed I couldn't be trusted because I had shown signs of being controlled. They started having family meetings after I went to bed. I only found out when I stayed up late studying for my trigonometry final. They even woke up my younger siblings, making them incredibly tired the next morning. I have no idea what they did in those meetings, but my little brother and sister were always really sore the next day too. When I tried to follow them, I saw all of the little traps they had set that could actually really hurt someone. A door with a brick at the top so that it would hit someone on the head when they pushed the door open. There was a wooden plank with a few nails sticking out of it on the stairs. It was almost like my parents had regressed to the thinking level of a child, and I was increasingly becoming more like the parent. My older brother stood guard at the door of the family meeting, so he could listen to what they said, but I could be kept out. Well, probably not just me. I think they were afraid the government, aliens, lizard people, or robots would also come and silence them. To be honest, I can't even keep up with the newest enemy. I couldn't move the traps during the meetings, but I made sure to remove the traps the next morning before someone actually got hurt. My dad started to listen to a ham radio that can listen into both the police and the military base nearby. Now my parents and brother take turns listening to it during the peak hours when our enemies are sending out their plans. I really miss the way my parents used to be. They were always a little weird, but when I was a kid, it was more in the way that parents are embarrassing weird in front of their friends. Now, they try to act like everyone else out in public. If I'm being honest, they act like they are being controlled by someone else. I mean, if you were to see them out in public, you would think they were criminals because of the way they are constantly looking around them and the crazy amount of things they take with them, even just to go to the pharmacy. Not that they go into stores much. When they do, they have an elaborate detection process that every item has to go through before any of us can use it. What is going on inside our house has only gotten worse over the last year. A few months ago, Rachel stopped by my school and asked me to visit her because she wanted to make sure I was all right. I mean, it wasn't like I didn't visit her often, so I started to feel a bit nervous. Is something wrong? I asked. She must have realized then that I was a little scared. Shaking her head, Rachel said, "No, not really. You just look like you need a break." It was only after she left that I began to really think that she was hiding something from me. Maybe she had wanted to talk about it, but my reaction had made her think twice. When I stopped by my grandparents' house to visit, they were all acting a little weird. Rachel was never a great liar, so her performance was easily the worst. I wanted to ask them what was wrong, but clearly they all felt that I was too young or that it would scare me too much. I tried asking several times, but they always brushed me off. We all sat outside to have dinner. My grandmother is a great cook, and my grandfather grills the best vegetables and fish. I love eating at their place, but this time I really couldn't enjoy it. Something was up, but no one was telling me. I excused myself from the table, saying I had to go to the bathroom. While they were eating, I snuck into Rachel's room. Yeah, I know I shouldn't have. She's a police officer, or will be soon, but I had to find out what they weren't telling me. I saw some papers that were clearly from work tucked away in one of her bags. My sister was never great at keeping things organized. Her handwriting wasn't great, but I had learned how to read it a long time ago, back before we became good friends. I pulled out the papers and the police were planning on arresting a bunch of conspiracy theorists. My uncle's name was on the list, and it said he was the prime suspect. He was apparently planning on breaking into the military base. I don't know what he and the rest were planning. All I knew was that I was glad my parents' names weren't on the list. But then I realized that my brother's name was. A voice startled me. "You shouldn't be doing that." It was Rachel. I wasn't going to apologize because I had every right to know. She explained how poorly thought out the plan was and that it wasn't expected that there would be anyone hurt, but they were still plotting to do something illegal. Once they started heading for the base, the police were going to arrest them. That happened a few weeks ago. My parents didn't know that my brother was going to do anything. He never told them. Apparently, he thinks they are too soft, that they aren't doing enough to protect us. My parents seemed very shaken because they never suspected my brother. Now, there are police officers stopping by their home every few days. I don't know which one they find more disturbing, the fact that my brother betrayed them or that the cops won't leave us alone. A few members of the media have shown up too, but they were quickly chased off our lawn. It's the only time my parents seem willing to call the police. I don't know what's going to happen. My parents haven't stopped believing in the conspiracies. If anything, they seem more convinced that the world is going crazy. I've heard my dad talking about moving the family out into the woods and living off the grid. I know that I will not go with them. What I'm worried about are my younger brother and sister. They seem to be learning a lot from my parents. Since they are much younger than Rachel and me, I'm afraid they are going to eventually believe everything. When I told my grandparents about my concerns, they said they will talk to my parents. If it comes down to it, they said they will take all of us into their home. None of us want to further involve the cops or the government either. For now, I'm still living at home, taking it one day at a time. I'm trying to be there for my younger brother and sister, just like Rachel was there for me. I've kind of learned how to counter some of my parents' concerns by using other conspiracy theories. Like, when they tried to pull us out of school, I said that the best way to understand the dangers was to see it. Just like my parents had learned. When my parents wanted to stop going to the doctor, I said that was what the government would want because it made us more vulnerable to easy problems. I told my parents that I would become a doctor so that we could eventually stop going to the doctor, but for now we had to continue so that it wasn't obvious. My parents look at me a little differently now. The family meetings have stopped, which makes me think that it had been my brother's idea anyway. My parents now say that he was crazy and careless. I have to stop myself from saying the same about them. They've started giving us healthier meals now, too. Mostly because I've started studying about nutrition. Since I'm going to be a doctor, they now believe me when I say that we need to be more careful about our diet. As long as I throw in something outrageous as part of my proof, my parents listen to me now. I want to help my parents, I really do, but they are adults and they are free to think whatever they want to think.